Today, we're finally getting back to requests, and to start things off, Final Gamer James has asked me to look at the book Northern Lights. Sadly, we don't have that book here in the United States. However, we do have a book called The Golden Compass, which is exactly the same as Northern Lights, except that it uses American English spellings and words, because apparently American kids can't handle seeing S's instead of Z's and extra U's after O's. Ah well. Either way, the book was first published in 1995 by Philip Pullman. About the author. Philip Pullman was born in 1946 in Norwich, England. His father was part of the Royal Air Force, and so the first years of his life were spent traveling around in current and former British colonies. His father was killed in action in 1954, specifically from fighting a tribal uprising in Kenya. Pullman has said that he saw his father as a hero back when he was a kid, but time and post-colonialism have given him a more complex perspective. Anyway, Pullman would go on to earn a bachelor's degree from Oxford University in 1968, specifically in English studies. He would go on to be a middle school teacher in Summertown, in Oxford suburb, and on the side he wrote school plays and enjoyed quite a bit of success at it. Pullman would eventually move on to writing novels, children's novels in particular, and in 1986 he was able to start teaching part-time and focus more of his attention on writing. In 1993, Pullman began work on what would become the His Dark Materials trilogy. The first book, Northern Lights, came out 2 years later, and it won him the Carnegie Award and the Guardian Award, both of which are a very big deal in the United Kingdom. To complete the trilogy, Pullman published The Subtle Knife in 1997 and The Amber Spyglass in 2000. Now let's talk about religion, because Pullman's views on religion have everything to do with why he wrote His Dark Materials. Pullman is a self-described Church of England atheist, which means that he was raised in the tradition of the Church of England, but he has since stopped believing in God. And that is an important distinction to make, by the way, because when an atheist criticizes religion, 9 times out of 10 he or she is specifically criticizing the religion he or she grew up with. And that is what the His Dark Materials trilogy is, a critique of organized religion, specifically the Church of England and the Catholic Church. It's been called an atheist response to C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, which, if you aren't aware, is a very Catholic set of fantasy books. However, while Pullman has been an outspoken critic of the Narnia books, his Materials trilogy has a completely different story, and the only things they have in common are that they're both fantasy books and they both have a message about religion. There was a movie adaptation that came out in 2007, but it managed to piss off both atheist and Catholic groups, and much more damning than that, it wasn't very good. So I won't talk about that any further, and instead move on to the story. Lyra Belacqua is a 12-year-old girl who lives with the scholars of Jordan College in Oxford during what seems like the late 19th century. And that's despite the fact that Jordan is a male-only institution. Like everyone else in this world, Lyra has a demon, in her case named Pantalaimon, or Pan for short. Like most demons, Pan is the opposite gender of his human, and like all other prepubescents, Pan can change his shape to that of any small or medium-sized animal. The demons of adults are set and never change, but before puberty, demons are constantly changing and trying out different shapes. One day, Lyra sneaks into the retiring room where only the college master and his chosen guests are allowed to be. She happens to be in this room when the master poisons a decanter of wine meant for Lord Asriel, Lyra's uncle and the man who convinced the master to raise Lyra at Oxford. So when Asriel shows up alone and goes for the wine, Lyra bursts out of her hiding spot to warn him. Asriel is a severe man, but Lyra did just save his life by trespassing, so he lets her stay hidden and listen in after everyone gathers, and he asks her to tell him what she sees during the meeting. Asriel puts on a presentation about dust with a capital D. Dust is a mysterious substance that comes out of the sky and collects in the bodies of adults, but not so much in the bodies of children whose demons have not yet settled on a shape. Furthermore, dust has some strange connection to the aurora borealis, and if a photograph is treated to show the dust spectrum, a city full of towering skyscrapers becomes visible in the aurora. Asriel wants to mount an expedition to the north to learn more about this city, and he's at the college to ask for funds. Asriel gets his money, and later there's a bit that Lyra doesn't see where the master says he only tried to kill Asriel because a device called an alethiometer said that the alternative would be worse. Lyra has had a rather scattershot education thanks to all of the college scholars trying to teach her about their specialties, but between lessons she hangs out with the lower class kids whose parents work at the college. She's much more at home with them than with the upper class scholars, but she's learned how to switch between accents at will. Life goes on fairly normal for Lyra, but elsewhere there's a creepily charming woman with a golden monkey demon who's been going around and talking random kids in the street into taking a trip with her. She abducts orphans and the children of loving families alike, and they all have only two things in common. They come from the lower classes, and they're all young enough that their demons haven't settled on a form yet. She's a part of a larger wave of abductions plaguing England, and while nobody knows who's responsible for them, they do have a name: the Gobblers. One day, the Gobblers strike in Oxford. They steal a boy named Billy from his Egyptian family, Egyptian meaning gypsy or the Romany people, and they also steal Roger, Lyra's best friend. There's nothing much she can do besides worry, but she soon forgets to do even that when she's visited by a woman named Mrs. Coulter. Mrs. Coulter is a creepily charming woman with a golden monkey demon, and yes, you the reader are supposed to put two and two together here. Mrs. Coulter charms Lyra straight away, and when she makes the master of Jordan College place Lyra in her care, Lyra is raring to go. However, the master has reservations about this, and he gives Lyra the alethiometer, telling her to keep it a secret from everyone, especially Mrs. Coulter. Lyra doesn't see the point, but she agrees. As for Lord Asriel, he's off on his expedition, and has been out of contact for months. Lyra goes with Mrs. Coulter to London. She finds out that Coulter is a woman of means, with connections to geographic societies and all kinds of people who go on adventures and explorations. However, Lyra eventually realizes that Mrs. Coulter is in charge of something called the General Oblation Board, or GOB for short. Gobblers. She also finds out that Lord Asriel has been captured somewhere in the north, and so Lyra immediately grabs a few things and flees Coulter's apartment. Lyra almost gets caught by some slavers in the back alleys of London, but she's saved by Egyptians, the same family that visits Oxford and lost their son Billy to the Gobblers. As it turns out, the family has a connection to Lyra's parents, and they tell her the story. Lyra's father fell in love with a married woman, and Lyra was the result of that love. The husband became murderously furious when he found out, and so Lyra's father killed him. As a result, his father lost his fortune and the two lovers' relationship was never the same. Neither parent wanted to raise Lyra, so they foisted her on the master of Jordan College. The Egyptians also know that Lyra's father is Lord Asriel, and her mother is Mrs. Coulter, so both of them have been lying about their relationship with her. The way the Egyptians fit in is that Lyra's original nursemaid is the matron of the family, Ma Costa, and the reason the Costas visit Oxford every year is to check up on Lyra. The Costas take Lyra to the wetlands of southeast England, a place where all the Egyptians are meeting to decide what to do about the Gobblers and their missing children. Along the way, Lyra learns to use the alethiometer. It's a curious device, which the text refers to only once as a golden compass, that can basically read the dust to tell its users secrets of the past and present, and make predictions of the future. Now, these predictions aren't guaranteed to happen, but they are very likely. The trouble is that the alethiometer is hard to use and even harder to interpret, but Lyra turns out to have a real knack for it, a talent that you only see once in a generation. Bear in mind that this device isn't one of a kind, but you can count the number that exist on two hands, and the number of people who can use one is even smaller. The Egyptian meeting takes place, led by John Fa, King of the Egyptians. Lyra has learned by this point that the abducted kids and the missing Lord Asriel are all being held prisoner in the Lapland region, the northernmost part of the Scandinavian peninsula. John Fa gathers money and volunteers from the Egyptians to mount a rescue operation, and Lyra convinces him to let her come since they could use someone who can read an alethiometer. The Egyptians make port in Trollesund in Lapland, and an old Egyptian named Farder gets in touch with the local witches. Witches are powerful and immortal women who can fly on broomsticks and who know a secret way to separate themselves from their demons. Normally, people feel an unbearable emotional pain when their demons are more than a few paces away, but witches can send their demons on messenger duties and scouting missions. There are several factions of witches in the north, and Coram hopes to get the help of at least one group since he saved their leader's life a few decades ago. She gets in contact, and while she can't help too much, at least not right away, she does tell them that they're looking for a place called Bolvangar. Meanwhile, Lyra has heard about an armored bear hanging out in Trollesund. Armored bears, also known as Panzerbjorn, are intelligent talking polar bears who build armor out of starforged steel. But the one in town, named Yorick Björnesson, has been banished from his community and got tricked out of his armor by the local humans, who now force him to work for them. Using the alethiometer, Lyra locates Yorick's armor and uncovers the trickery, and so in exchange Yorick pledges to join the expedition. Joining him is an old friend of Yorick's, a Texan aeronaut with a helium balloon named Lee Scoresby. During the march to Bolvangar, the alethiometer tells Lyra to find someone in a nearby village. That person turns out to be Tony, one of the abducted children. The Gobblers have performed an intercision on Tony, which means that the connection between him and his demon has been severed. This was deeply traumatic to Tony, and he doesn't live for much longer after Lyra finds him. After that, the Egyptian expedition gets attacked by a roving band of Tartars, people from the central steppes of Asia who are only this far north because the Gobblers are paying them to act as security. The Tartars kidnap Lyra, but it turns out it's not because they know who she is, but because Bolvangar pays them for any child who ends up at their doorstep. So Lyra pretends to be the daughter of an English merchant who isn't that bright, so that the guards will overlook her. Not that she has to try very hard to fool them, because most of the staff is rather slow and unmotivated. As Lyra later finds out, they also got intercised. Lyra fishes for information from the other captured children, many of whom don't realize how much danger they're in. She finds Roger, and together they create a distraction and find the cages where demons of intercised kids are being held. A witch's demon spots them and helps them free the demons, and he then goes to the Egyptians to tell them about Lyra's escape plan. Lyra gets caught and almost intercised, but Mrs. Coulter spots her just in time to stop the procedure. This does show that Mrs. Coulter loves her daughter after all, but of course it also goes against everything that she and the other Gobblers were saying about how intercision is good for you. The escape takes place, Lyra gets away from Mrs. Coulter, and the kids manage to reach the Egyptians safely. However, Lord Asriel is still being held prisoner by the armored bears of Svalbard, and so Lyra, Roger, and Yorick get on Lee Scoresby's balloon, and the flying witches tow them to the bears' settlement. But then they get attacked by another faction of witches, and the balloon crashes. So, earlier in the book, we've learned that Yorick was originally the rightful king of Svalbard, but he was banished for murdering a fellow bear. However, it turns out that their current king, Iofur Raknison, drugged Yorick so that he wouldn't hold back during a ritual combat. Plus, he's been working with Mrs. Coulter and acting like he was human, to the point where he desperately wishes he had a demon, something that only humans get. Lyra gets isolated from the others in the crash, so when she goes to Svalbard, she talks her way into speaking to Iofur privately, and she tells him that she's Yorick's demon. The people of Bolvangar successfully gave him one, and she's human because Yorick is an animal, and so of course this demon would be human. That just follows. However, she wants to be Iofur's demon since he's so much stronger, but that will only happen if Iofur kills Yorick in single combat. The reason she tricks him like this is because, as an exile, Yorick has no honor, and so Yofor could have just had his guards kill him. Naturally, Yorick wins the duel, becomes the king of the Armored Bears again, and helps Lyra track down Lord Asriel. As it turns out, Asriel has been treated well during his captivity and allowed to continue his experiments, and while Lyra has come all this way to rescue him, he acts rather cold and distant to her. Still, he does explain some setting background. The church, which Mrs. Coulter and the Gobblers work for, believe that dust is the physical evidence of original sin, and it only settles on adults because they're old enough to be confirmed in their religion. Dust even gets its name from Genesis chapter 3, the fall of man. However, Asriel is convinced it somehow comes from the alternate dimension seen in the Aurora Borealis, and he means to travel there. The only thing keeping Lord Asriel from doing so is the fact that he needs a strong power source to bridge the two worlds. But as it turns out, you can get a ton of power from severing a child from his demon. So, while Lyra sleeps that night, Asriel kidnaps Roger and takes a dog sled team to his experiment site. Yorick and Lyra chase after him, but Yorick has to stay behind when Lyra has to cross a narrow ice bridge. Lyra gets there too late, and then she and Roger fall halfway down a cliff. Thus, she can do nothing but watch as Lord Asriel and Mrs. Coulter reunite and the bridge between worlds opens. As it turns out, Lyra's parents still love each other, although Coulter doesn't love Asriel enough to go with him to the other dimension. At the same time, Lyra has realized that Asriel wants to destroy the source of dust, while Coulter wants to cut people off from it. And since both of them are doing terrible things, this must mean that the dust is good instead of bad. It's up to Lyra and her demon Pan to find the source of the dust first and do something to stop them. And so they follow Lord Asriel and cross the bridge between worlds. So ends Book 1. The analysis. So, the anti-religious message in the Golden Compass is pretty obvious when you consider that what's essentially the Catholic Church is performing what's essentially lobotomies on children in a hidden facility in Scandinavia. Incidentally, Scandinavian hospitals lobotomized over twice the number of people per capita in the United States, and the United Kingdom lobotomized nearly half as many people as the United States while having less than a quarter of the population. The argument for performing an intercision, as presented by Mrs. Coulter, is that it clears away original sin, the sin that all humans are guilty of regardless of how virtuous and blameless their lives are, and which can only be forgiven by embracing Christ as the Savior. Catholics perform baptism at birth to clear away original sin, but they also say that the original sin still affects human nature and is the reason why humans are tempted to commit sins. But then there's another interpretation of original sin which seems to be used by both Christian and anti-Christian groups. The original sin committed by Adam and Eve is eating a forbidden fruit. This fruit is called the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, and therefore seeking knowledge, particularly outside the context of a Christian education, is widely considered a form of sin. And while I don't believe original sin is often used as the reasoning to reject knowledge, it is true that Christian organizations have objected to things like the heliocentric solar system model, the idea that Jupiter could have its own moons, the idea that the Earth is billions of years old instead of thousands, and the idea that humans and gorillas have a common ancestor. We also see books and movies where the message is that there are some things humanity was never meant to know, which is pretty much bullshit from an atheist's perspective. If there's no divinity, then humanity isn't meant to know or not know anything. And in general, knowing more is better than knowing less because knowledge allows us to make the best decisions possible. Intercision is justified by saying it clears away original sin for good, but what it effectively does is rob people of their souls, their uniqueness, their free will, and it turns them into simpletons who can only do what they're told and don't do it very well either. Like lobotomies, intercision is performed not to help the people who get the treatment, but to make them easier to handle. This is why lobotomies were performed much more often on women than on men. Anyhow, the Golden Compass is about more than just religion. The book pretty much goes after societal dogma of all sorts. There's the feminist angle, for instance. Lyra is a highly intelligent girl, smarter than most boys her age, and she would have thrived in an academy like Jordan College if she'd had a formal education. However, this is Oxford in the mid-19th century, and women are not accepted as students. Then there's the ambitious Mrs. Coulter, who, as a woman, has very few avenues she can take to realize that ambition. She first tried the traditional method of marrying into power, but that ended when her lover killed her husband. She couldn't join the priesthood as a woman, so instead she convinced the bishops to create a lay society, the General Oblation Board, and to put her in charge of it. Mind you, Coulter is still a monster who kidnaps and lobotomizes children, but it's worth noting that doing this is essentially the only way Coulter could have gained the power she wanted. The Golden Compass also has a classist component. The upper-class Mrs. Coulter is using the resources of the wealthy church to kidnap children off the street and steal them away from their lower-class families. And in England, you don't get much lower class than the gypsies. Hell, even that name for the Romani people is an insult. And so naturally, the Egyptians in the book are the ones who put together a righteous army to rescue the abducted children, joined by a faction of emancipated women and a group of tribal natives who until recently were being puppeted by a colonial power. And that's a whole thing too. King Yofer is in love with Western culture and has no pride in his native traditions. This lets Mrs. Coulter manipulate him by promising him that he could be fully accepted as a Westerner, even though that was never going to happen. He's a bear, after all, and a bear only looks silly if he tries to act like a human. So on top of everything else, the Golden Compass is also post-colonialist. I could keep going, but I think you get the gist by now. So thanks for joining me again for today's book review, and I hope I'll see you next time when I shift genres to music.